Hello, and welcome to a session of Close Calls with California Poison Control System. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Cyrus Rangan, and our featured guest today is Dr. Ben Sutoka with the California Poison Control System. And I'm Dr. Race Bora, also with California Poison Control, Fresno Madera Division. We're going to be talking today about a topic that you might have heard about on the news. It's certainly becoming more of an issue here in California, and we're certainly hearing more about it on our phone lines at California Poison Control. It's called kratom or mitragynine, and a related compound is called 7-hydroxy. So we'll just jump right into it. Dr. Sutoka, why don't you walk us through the origin story of this very interesting compound and set of compounds? What exactly is kratom? Where did it come from?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Kratom was first, I think, described back in the 1800s. It was used in the Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Malaysia. And they really used it as a substitute for opium. And so, you know, I guess if you didn't have access to the opium trade, or just didn't have the funds to acquire opium, people use this locally growing plant as sort of a substitute. It has uh, very similar effects to some of the painkiller products like morphine. Um, and it's actually much more potent, or can be much more potent than morphine is. Um, it has several different active constituents in the plant itself. The 7-hydroxy compound seems to be much more potent. Um, and I think that's really what's driving a lot of the cases that we're seeing these days and calls that we're getting into the poison control center is these concentrated products of the 7-hydroxy compound. Um, and also, there are some early descriptions of some stimulant effects that people get from kratom as well. So it's a very interesting type of product. When they gave it to animal models, it looked in some of those models much more like cocaine effects uh, than it did opioid effects. So it's got two different types of syndromes that it causes. And we see some very interesting cases that get called into the poison center from emergency rooms across the state where, we get these mixed overdose situations. So it's a very challenging drug to deal with.
Do you think that some of the
Wow.
reason that we might be seeing this sort of increase in the use of this is that even though it's kind of like opiates, they're not the same and they're not controlled or regulated in the same way that morphine and related compounds are?
Yeah, it just seems like every few years or decade, a different opioid epidemic comes about. So we started with prescription drugs, and then the FDA cracked down a lot on those, and then we saw people going back to illicit substances. Fentanyl then became a huge problem with different derivatives of fentanyl being produced. And now I think it's just moved to something that's easily accessible to people. People were using it as to enhance their mood, I think, to treat pain, to treat withdrawal symptoms. But I think more recently we are seeing much higher number of cases that people are actually using it as a recreational drug.
Mhm.
Um, and I think they just don't know what they're getting, and I think that's where we're seeing the toxicity of these very concentrated 7-hydroxy compounds.
Yeah, that's great information. And it sounds like there's the whole leaf product, but then the 7-hydroxy is almost like a concentrated version of just one of the many different molecules inside the whole leaf. And that's the one that seems to be causing even more of a problem just because it has that potency to where it can be even more potent than morphine. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The plant material itself, I think, like the capsules in the picture show that, it really, I don't think, had a lot of the same more severe effects that we're seeing, like seizures and, decreased respirations where people have trouble breathing. Um, and so it does seem by itself, as an agent, much more
So
toxic.
if someone has decreased respirations or stops breathing, is this a compound where like Narcan or naloxone will be
Uh,
required in some cases?
yeah, oh, for sure.
Okay,
I think there have been fatalities associated with kratom and the 7-hydroxy compounds, probably in particular, where they had difficulty breathing and couldn't breathe and expired. Um, I think people have definitely tried naloxone or Narcan to reverse its effects, um,
sure.
with differing efficacy. So it could be that doses aren't high enough that people are getting. It just may not respond as well. It just may be much more potent to reverse. So I think it's not clear thus far.
And I imagine
I've
that
also
people may be, I'm sorry, I just imagine that people may be also taking a compound like this along with their other opiates, maybe for an enhanced effect and maybe even to try to reduce the
Mm.
amount of the other opiate. And so you might see some combination exposures as well. Is that
that's
Oh,
correct?
sure.
exactly what I was that's
Yeah.
exactly what I was going to say is
Yeah.
it seems like when we read about some of the fatalities that have unfortunately happened with kratom or just even severe hospitalizations, sometimes it's related to mixing and you know if this compound is mixed with other sedating agents, whether that's alcohol or muscle relaxers, sleeping pills,
Yeah.
etc., then that can have an additive effect. So that's another risk dimension that kratom seems to be a part of that story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think we see that in a lot of the toxicology tests that they run here at San Francisco General, where you'll identify 5 or 7 different, categories of substances that people have in their blood at a time. So the combination of these things are certainly at least additive um, to the
So
to
it
the
it would
potential.
require, I think it would require specialized toxicology testing because it usually doesn't show up in the normal drug screen that's done at the hospitals.
Yes.
But like Dr. Rangan said, these are unregulated compounds. So from the perspective of the street supply, as it were, it seems like it's a mixed bag where you could have different things added to something that's called kratom, but it's not regulated and it's
Uh,
very unpredictable what's actually in that stuff.
Oh, yeah. I think that's very true. We've seen that with lots of the other epidemics that have come before,
You've
kratom.
you've you've been doing some research about this. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your preliminary findings and what sorts of trends we're seeing here in California?
Yeah, we're doing a study with two of the 4 centers in the state, actually, San Francisco and the Fresno site, to look at the huge increase in calls that we're getting statewide over the past 10 years. So we're going to look at the trend of calls to the poison center, which have exploded really in the last few years, and really have we've seen a huge uptake nationwide. Looking at the national data from about 2017 or so, um, it's interesting that around 2016, the FDA tried to schedule kratom and 7-hydroxy as a Schedule One substance, so it would be illegal to have possess anywhere in the U.S. But I think with some public outcry, they withdrew that toward
Mm,
the end of 2016 October, and then the following year, actually, the numbers started to jump quite a
yeah.
bit, and we're seeing a lot of calls, but the bigger problem, I think, is we're seeing more serious cases now. Um,
Mm,
I think we've had a preliminary data is about 1,000 plus cases just in the past 10 years in California. And then we're going to look at, what effects people are having, and if possible, I think it might not be as it might not be as easy to gather the data, but to see if it really is these 7-hydroxy compound containing products that are really the cause of all these problems.
Thank you. Yeah, and it seems that the regulatory framework is a little bit slippery as well, just because at the national level, there's that conversation going on. Certainly, the FDA and other national agencies have tried to warn about kratom itself, and also especially about the 7-hydroxy as being a very potent opioid that's much too accessible currently. And then we see at the more local level that there are kind of policies and proposals out there to really restrict the access of this medication. I wouldn't even call it a medication, but some people do. But of this compound, but that's where the pushback comes from, is because there's also a more or less vocal subset of people that do see kratom as something that could be used as a medication or an alternative medication. Um, why is that? Can you explain? What are people using it for that that they believe that it's therapeutic in some respect? And is there a way out of that impasse? What can we think about to help people be safe, but also treat whatever they're trying to treat? Can you comment on that, or any insights there?
Yeah, I think people have tried to use it for different, I guess, different medical uses. Mood to help with depression. People have tried to use it to treat their pain, um, especially I think since the crackdown on prescription opioids occurred several years ago. People also use it to treat their opiate withdrawal syndrome. Um, so, opiate use disorder is a very difficult thing for people to deal with, and not everybody can deal with available agents used to treat that. So people will go out on their own and try to treat their own symptoms with kratom. And I think historically the plant product, probably was okay. People were using, back in Thailand, they used to chew the leaf actually, and in those sort of oh, I don't know if you call it whatever traditional uses. It was fine. It helped them work more and less fatigued, and um,
Mhm.
and they didn't seem to become addicted like people are today, even to kratom. And
Mhm.
we're seeing pretty significant withdrawal symptoms from kratom itself, or 7-hydroxy compound itself. So it's quite different now, and um,
It's
it,
complicated. Yeah. No, I thank you for those comments. I mean, I think it's definitely a conversation that is long overdue. Is how do we keep people safe, but also address chronic pain and some of the other mental health issues, and obviously opioid addiction. We know that there's a lot of great addiction resources throughout California. Certainly, poison control helps to point people to all of those kinds of addiction doctors and clinics whenever people call us with that issue. But on the other hand, people also need to know that you know this substance does induce dependence. It can cause withdrawal, and in some cases, it can even cause fatalities, or has been associated with fatalities. So we just want people to have good education around this issue, so that they understand. Because the story that I've heard is a lot of people didn't know that it was an opioid like substance.
mm,
They started using it, and then
mm,
they became habituated to it. And then before they knew it, they were at opioid withdrawal, and they had no idea. I mean, there's no labeling. There's really very, very poor education to the public about exactly what this stuff is. It's sold as an energy drink. It's often targeted to young people with very attractive packaging, etc. So you can sort of see why this is a slippery slope, that you have an opioid-like substance that's literally available in gas stations and vape shops, and
Yeah.
that has a lot of parents and civic leaders concerned that we need to regulate this and restrict access to it, and at the same time educate the public and really provide better guardrails so that people don't get into trouble with it, which I think is something we can all agree on.
Oh yeah. Yes, definitely.
Let's just wrap up with some safety tips, and just talk about some key takeaways related to Kratom and 7-hydroxy products. I think one thing we want everyone to understand is just because it's natural doesn't make it safe. Another key takeaway that we've got from our conversation is that these products have been associated with severe side effects, whether it's related to acute or long-term toxicity or even withdrawal as a result of their opioid-like effects. They can cause opioid withdrawal. And because they're opioid-like, they can also respond to, and some people may benefit from, the use of Narcan, also known as naloxone, whenever they have an overdose. So just keep that in mind as well. Lots to know, lots that we're still figuring out around these substances. But certainly we want everyone to be on the same page about the key takeaways that are scrolling at the bottom of your screen there. We're always available to help answer any questions at our toll-free hotline. You can always call us at 1-800-222-1222. Specialists in poison information, like Dr. Sutoka, and medical toxicologists like myself and Dr. Rangan are standing by to help answer any questions you have about kratom, opioids, plant poisonings, or prevention of addiction and overdose. Thanks for joining us on this session of Close Calls with California Poison Control. And thank you, Dr. Sutoka and Dr. Rangan, for being on this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.